Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Geopolitics with Tyberius D. For anyone who was watching on the Twitch show, or anyone who's noticing that this is a little scheduled off, well, generally speaking, as I've kind of moved into my depressive phase of my bipolar disorder, so getting my schedule on time, particularly with the show, is going to be a little bit harder. We're going to try to make sure at least the uploads are consistent, so hopefully we'll stick with that, but if you guys want to help me out with that'd be great. Or if you guys are just waiting for the show, it might be a day or two late, worst case scenario. Hopefully that's all the worst it gets, but it's really hard for me personally. Make sure I'm on the same schedule when I do a full-time job, and then on top of that do this, is that when I'm in my depressive phase, I don't have the energy that I do in my manic phase. The manic phase, I can literally sleep 6 hours and be fine. Depressive, I usually go for 12, so it's not exactly fun. So let's talk about Scandinavia, right? So before I get there, Geopolitics Tiberius D is brought to you by our wonderful patron committee that is Andrew Wagner, the Wes Dude, and Julia. I appreciate all that you guys do. You guys have been a wonderful help for the community and for the show, and we've got a few things working that I think you guys are going to really enjoy. All right, so Scandinavia. First segment, the history. What's the history that brings Scandinavia, or not Scandinavia? Sorry, Sweden. What is the history that brings Sweden into the modern era? Well, pretty straightforward. We're going to start the same way we did in the Norway, but this one will be quite a bit longer, and that's the Kalmar Union, when basically all of Scandinavia is brought together under the Danish kingdom. You have the Danes, you have Norway, you have Sweden, and Sweden is not Sweden in the way that we think of. Norway is largely the same area that it is now. Always kind of has maintained a very similar geographic structure. Sweden did not have control of the southern tip of what we now think of as Sweden. That was actually controlled by the Danes. But more importantly, they actually had control of what we call Finland, or at least most of it. And so Sweden was huge. Basically had all of Scandinavia under one union at this point. So, under the Kalmar Union, you have this superpower, which is this Nordic superpower, if you will, that I'm not going to say dominates all of European affairs, but it's significantly strong. That being said, there's a lot of internal divisions. The Norwegians aren't really a big fan of everybody else because they always get told what to do. Sweden did not like being part of a coalition or of a union that was ruled by the Danes, because the Danes were significantly weaker and smaller than them. And so eventually Sweden will break away. Of course, Norway will eventually break away too, but then they'll get swiped up as Sweden. We'll talk about that later. There's some bits and pieces of the history here that I don't know very well, and I apologize for that. So I'm going to skip around a little bit. Where Sweden really becomes important, it's around 1500, about the same time that England is getting important. So while England is working on building out what will eventually become the Royal Navy and building out traditions of not only naval seamanship throughout its country, but working on sail and colonialization and what eventually all this will be, Sweden's kind of having the same thing, but in its own rules and territory. What we see is that they develop a very martial and administrative ability. In the administrative ability, they develop quite a sophisticated tax system that allows them to, basically build out a tax infrastructure, that builds out a governing structure, that builds out a administrative and military structure that allows them to outcompete everybody around them. And you'll see this come the 30 Years' War, when, with a little bit of diplomacy and just a pretty decent amount of military prowess, Sweden's able to come in and basically end it. Now, mind you, that France had done a lot of the heavy lifting beforehand, even though France had been defeated just a few years prior. By the time Sweden comes in, Sweden is able to flip what will be Prussia-Brandenburg into the alliance, and they'll basically get all the Protestants back onto the side or on a single side. And they will wholesale defeat Spain and the Holy Roman Empire in the Catholic side. And that's impressive. And, for Sweden, which only had a population of 3 million people at the time, versus like all of Germany and Spain, which had tens. This is really impressive. Now, there's a lot we can get into there, whether it's, scaling or whatever, but the long and the short here is that they were militarily disciplined, they were administratively competent, and they had a long tradition of this. And this will last for quite a while. And I would say this will actually last all the way until just after the Great Northern War, when everything kind of goes to crap for them. There's a number of affairs that Sweden will be able to participate in that will absolutely put them on the geopolitical forefront. They'll largely be trying to dominate the Baltic Sea writ large. So they really, they'll deal with Norway, but they don't really go after Norway. Their large thing is Finland and getting into what we now call the Baltic states, northern Poland, and a little bit of northern Germany. Like, their goal was Baltic domination. Because it was a massive trade area, and for a while it was working really, really well. Problem: they keep running into everybody, and everybody eventually coalitioned them to give her point. So the Danes would absolutely get hammered by the Swedes because the Danes were even weaker than the Swedes. Poland, Lithuania would try to fight the Swedes here and there, but the Swedes would absolutely crush them because Poland was very much not a unified state. They had an elected monarchy. There was a lot of political intrigue, which kept any kind of main political entity from unifying into a administrative, political, economic entity that really, really could go smacking people. That would prove to be their detriment. That's basically what ends the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So they kind of fall apart, and the Swedes are able, or not fall apart, but they'll eventually go to crap, and they never really do get it together all that well since the Jagiellons actually come to the throne. It doesn't work out, right? And so Sweden is largely able just to raffle stomp them. But then comes Russia. And Russia, at first, gets their nose beat in by the Swedes. I think they'll fight 3 wars, but don't quote me on that. But what tends to happen is that the first 2 major engagements, the Russians and the Swedes will largely go tick for tat, and the borders won't change really much at all. But then comes Peter the Great. And Peter is the guy that does all the reformations in Europe, or in Russia. He wants to make it a lot more like a European state, kind of pull them forward into a modern, what's the word here? Well, kind of wants to pull them forward into a modern system. So he knows he needs a major port to do so. And of course, this is the creation of St. Petersburg or Petrograd or Leningrad or whatever the hell it may be, right? That will be done under his reign. But that's ruled by Sweden. And so there's a long and a short here. But this is the Great Northern War. And what happens is you get everyone to coalition them together to fight Sweden. Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia all basically join an alliance. Now, Denmark goes in first. They actually kind of jump the gun a little bit. They're literally just knocked out of the war before the other 2 can even mobilize. Poland, Lithuania, and Russia kind of work together, but Poland literally has its nose beat in so bad that they fall into a civil war. And that does not go over very well, right? And literally the Swedes will actually be playing sides in that for most of the Civil War, supporting one governing or supporting one candidate for the electorship of the crown. While that's all going on, you'll actually have this guy who is really, really good at losing on the other side. He'll actually win only like 1 battle, but it'll be enough to actually win kind of like the whole side. But that's largely because the Russians are putting up the brunt work. So let's talk about the Russian campaign. Russia and the Swedes will go blow for blow, and the Swedes will probably actually win most of the battles that they fight against the Russians. It's very, very impressive. They're outnumbered usually 2-1 every single time, sometimes 4-1. But the Russians, they're not as disciplined as the Swedes are by far. Their officer corps isn't very competent compared to the Swedes. It just, by all military traditions and doctrine, they're just not as capable as the Swedes, and the Swedes will absolutely get the drop on them more often than not. The thing about that we said in the Russia episode about their history is that they're able to literally just meat grind everybody into dust because Russia's huge. And that will largely kind of be the case. Russia will fight the Great Northern War for 21 years. Sweden Sweden very much being the case. I did forget what started the Great Northern War was that the Swedish crown, the king had died, and it passed to a young 15-year-old. Charles is something. I'm thinking it's like Charles the 12th or Charles the 15th. I forget which one. I apologize, but he's actually very, very confident, or competent and confident. A lot of people are like, oh well, that's actually what fires off the coalitions. They're like, oh, weak young ruler, let's go beat him. It turns out, no. He's raised very strongly. He's very charismatic. He's able to just kind of walk in and beat the living snot out of everybody. Very competent, but eventually. That will kind of come to an end in a very poor light. So let's fast forward to that. The biggest problem with the Swedes is that they do eventually start losing, and they actually get their army trapped all the way down. They were rolling through what is southern Russia, which is more of like northern Ukraine at this point, and in through the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I'm just going to call it the Commonwealth, right? They're rolling through the Commonwealth. No, I'm sorry. I can't call it the Commonwealth because there's the British Commonwealth. So let's call it the PLC. They're going through the southern part of the PLC, southern part of Russia, like right there on the border, and they'll eventually get into both of those people's arch nemesis, which is the Ottoman Empire. They'll be defeated for like the first time, and they're actually forced into the Ottoman Empire, which the Ottomans will house them for a quick minute. But Charles doesn't exactly do diplomacy very well while dealing with the Ottoman Sultanate, and he basically gets himself kicked out. This is a critical failure on his part because the Swedes were starting to get ground down, and they really needed the Ottomans to come in to kind of help them. This failure, do or not, is basically what will sail in, or what will end the Swedes in the Great Northern War. Is that they're not able to get a major ally on their side. The Ottomans they really needed. And it actually would have been in the Ottoman interest to do so, but diplomatic insults and slights abound. They didn't join in, so. Here we go. That being said, they had recently just signed a peace treaty with the Russians, not terribly long, within like the last 5 years. So they were exhausted after a prior war, and the Ottomans didn't really want to get back in on one. However, it probably would have been smart of them to do so. But that's a conversation for our history nerds. Let's roll this to the end. The first major game that the Russians will get is actually on the Isthmus of Karelia, I believe is what it's called. But it's the place where St. Petersburg is built. And they'll actually, before the war's even over, Peter the Great will start building St. Petersburg. And then he uses that kind of like as a military camp and a base operations to launch campaigns throughout the region. He'll largely more work on the Baltic states instead of Finland. But the long and the short here is that with the Great Northern, or with this all wrapping up, Sweden eventually gets put in a box, and I can't remember where the final battle really is. But what happens is that Sweden is, I think, sieging somebody else. I can't remember. There's a siege involved, and what happens is that this young king, which is now in his 30s, goes out to inspect the line and never comes back. And they'll eventually find him the next morning with a hole in his head. At that point, he's really the only thing keeping the war going, because he's the leader. He's kind of going. Everyone else is kind of exhausted, and it's through his sheer charisma of Charles that basically is keeping the war going, because he's defending the honor of Sweden, and he's defending the geopolitical position of Sweden. He's right in that regard. Sweden is basically going to get knocked off the world edge, and so with the death of Charles, the nobility of Sweden will basically sue for peace, and they'll lose horribly. Now, somebody told me I was wrong on this one, but I'll have to just double check. But the long and the short here is that Sweden will lose all of their Baltic provinces of Livonia and what will be northern Estonia, which I'm pretty sure is part of that. But more importantly, they'll lose Finland, all to the Russians. Now, somebody told me that Finland will get lost later. You can double check that. Maybe I'm wrong, but maybe there is one more final battle. But generally, from the Great Northern War, this is literally when Russia is seen as a rise and actually joins the Great Powers Club. When Sweden is actually ejected from the Great Powers Club, they'll never be seen as a major power from this point on again. which is sad for the Swedes, but, it's just the ebbs and tides of history. Is you need a geopolitical advantage, and while they had one for a time, it was more of a competency advantage rather than a geopolitical, I have size, I have girth, and I can beat the hell out of you with it. So, that era closed. Let's roll on to after that. Well, basically, they'll just largely be looking around their neighborhood. They'll look around helping out with Finland when they can, but more often than not, that's completely occupied from the Russians all the way up until World War I, when Finland will break away. We'll talk about. Give me a second here. They'll eventually actually get a lot more involved with Norway, because Norway is, a geopolitical, not adversary, but it's involved with. It's involved on the, very close in proximity, so very much something that they want. They have to keep an eye on. They'll have some good relations with Denmark. They'll actually get the southern tip of Sweden from Denmark at some point. I don't remember exactly how that happens, but we'll close out like the late Enlightenment era with Sweden basically on the back foot after the Great Northern War. And that leads us into more modern history, where we get into World Wars I, II, and whatnot. Throughout the Industrial Age, Sweden basically will just control most of what we think of as modern Sweden and Norway. And that's basically their coup de grace. They'll eventually let Norway go because of popular referendum. They're one of the first countries that really start to take to democracy in a big way. So, that liberal tradition that we think of Sweden for, that starts even back in the 1800s. And then we'll just skip. It's just, World War I comes around. The Swedes stay out of it. They don't want to get in the blood path, and they're probably right for do so. They have nothing to gain. So they'll largely get out of that. World War II comes around. This is where this gets tricky. Sweden was in a really bad spot. Norway and Denmark were invaded by Nazi Germany, of course, in 1940, in the very early months of 1940. Denmark's literally knocked out in a few hours. Literally just has a few paratroopers and a tank division roll in, and it's over. Norway will last about a week, but just because of the sheer scale and factor, they're not able to make it. This is kind of seen as like Sweden's only chance. They could have gotten in and taken the fight to the Germans. They probably would have lost. And so if you're looking at that, kind of a big deal. But if the Swedes really wanted to help, that was a big deal. Especially considering part of the invasion was to get Swedish iron ore was one of the big things. But, Sweden was getting rich, so why bother, right? The Swedes will largely try to play as neutral as possible. They're not that neutral. They'll actually play a little bit of everybody's side, believe it or not. So when it comes to the Axis, and particularly Nazi Germany, the Swedes will allow the free movement of troops throughout Sweden, so that the Germans can basically move troops through their territory to Norway and through Finland all the way up into Russia. That's part of it. The Russians are not happy about this. What also happens, though, is that the Swedes will actively play intelligence sides to help the Russians, and they'll actually, there's a bit of a debate on whether the Swedish intelligence helps the Russians or not. I really think they did, because the Russians really didn't throw a hammer at Sweden after the war, which, part of it may be just because of the fact that they were exhausted. That's possible. I really think they had reason. And that was that the Swedish intelligence services were probably helping them by passing off information of German troop movements that were going through Sweden. The Russians knew almost all of them. Now there's a big conversation going on about if the Russian intelligence services actually were just that good in Sweden, or if the Swedes were actually helping them. I'm more on the Swedes were helping them side of this conversation, because the level of detail and the level of quality was even above the Russian intelligence usual ability to operate. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Russians had a really good intelligence service that starts really around World War I. They for some reason, they're just really good at it. I don't know if they're exactly why that is. There's a big debate on that one as well. But the Russians basically have a major intelligence network, going into the 1910s. that will rival everybody to this day, if not be probably the largest, most effective. They're really good at getting secrets. And the real conversation here that a lot of people have is more over what Lenin and Stalin do. I think this is really where it takes off. Is that Lenin and Stalin basically realize that they need intelligence gathering abilities to gather technology from the West, to know what everybody's doing, because they're very, very scared of the capitalistic West, and eventually, particularly, the fascist West. Fascist West, wow. And they'll go out there. Now, I'm sorry for the derail, but it's very, very important. It's very, very important, but generally, Russian intelligence is a really big deal for the Swedes from this point out, because the Swedes have to deal with it. So, World War II is over. And the Russians don't really get up their rear end on this one. So, where we go from here is that the Swedes have to figure out what their role they're going to play in the Cold War. The Swedes largely go for neutrality again, but this time they're a lot more adept at it. Now, there's a big conversation of whether if they were pro-NATO. Probably definitively, if everything went to crap, they would be more siding with NATO, but unless properly invaded, they wouldn't have actually sided. And there's a few things that actually support this. Largely is the fact that they were the last country to join the nuclear non-proliferation movement. They really didn't want to sign off on that. They actively were talking about and maybe did some research into having their own nuclear weapons, because they were nervous whether it would be a NATO West that would actually kind of roll in just to secure a geopolitical advantage, or if the Russians would. Judging by the tensions that were had overall, the Russians probably instigated some very bad relations, particularly at the end of the 70s and the early 80s. There's a few few incidences with submarines that they would have, which leads me to believe by like 1985, the Swedes were absolutely not like in the NATO camp, but obviously more pro-NATO. And the Russians kept instigating that. Probably a bad move on their part, considering how far left Sweden was to everybody else. But hey, what are you going to do? So we roll into finally more of the more modern era with Sweden. And that is Sweden comes in post-Cold War, very stable, hadn't dropped near the amount of defensive resources into. Sweden hasn't dropped as nearly as much of military resources that the NATO and Warsaw Pact had. And so they had already kind of built themselves out, and then when they demilitarized even further, more or less they would largely just be able to be the first on the gap of being able to really build out a social democracy in the way that we see today, and particularly throughout most of Western Europe. It's not what's the word here? Sweden just basically rolls into modern Sweden, or to Sweden of today in the post-Cold War. We can talk a bit about like what they're doing now, what's going on in the political sphere of Sweden, but outside of dealing with a few minor issues, it's not really too bad for them. Although there was a couple of things in the more recent years, particularly the last 10 years, that are starting to catch my eye. They're having some real ethical conversations about what's going on there that makes me very, very interested to see where they're going to go. I'd have to double check this. I'm not really versed on Swedish politics, but from what I was told in their last election, they actually elected the most right-wing government they've had since the end of World War II. I don't know if that is true. I need to check that. I apologize. Somebody in the community told me that, and I never got a chance to verify that. So I'm going to close out the history section. So yeah, chat, if you guys want to ask me some questions, because I don't have a co-host on the history of Sweden, maybe I can answer that well, maybe I can't. Just to look after... Damn, have you lost weight? I need to check that. I only think I'm down like a pound, but whatever. Incorrect. It was a coalition with the left and the right in order to keep the racist party out of government. Okay. Thank you for the clarification, AA. AA is actually a former Swede. So, thank you for being here. Appreciate that. But yeah, the racist party, which I can't remember who it is. Neolibs, libs, SocDems were together. Yeah, there was a bunch of people that got together in Sweden to kind of counteract the Swedish version of the AFD, from what I understand. Which is fine. Could you imagine? Yeah. Anyway, if anyone has any conversation, if anyone has any other questions, we can ask that real quick. There's a racist party in Sweden. Think of them kind of as like a neo-Nazi party. We're seeing the rise of far right parties throughout most of Europe. It's actually one of the big reasons why I've said that fascism is coming back to Europe, is that the far right is very much getting stronger very, very quickly throughout all of Europe, and it's something to be very, very concerned with. So, yeah, scary. Is it like how Trump or people call Trump a Nazi or real Nazis? Great question, actually. I didn't like to buy into the trap of calling Trump a fascist all the way up until after the election, when he started calling the election it was rigged and whatever, which was blatantly false. At that point, I was getting to the point of calling it him a fascist. So yeah. But no, AA is correct here in the chat, saying that these people are like real Nazis. Yes, they are. They are like hardcore ethno-nationalist. If you look at their political ads for these parties, and remind you, they don't have the First Amendment. So the fact that Europeans even let this fly is kind of scary. There's literally just, get rid of the Islam political ads that you'll see in flyers and whatnot throughout all of Europe, particularly in the more Germanic peoples, such as Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, that kind of light. It's very concerning, to be honest. But yeah, I'm I'm very interested to see where it goes. But the next section, we're going to talk about the geography, real quick. Sweden's geography is not terrible. It's pretty good, actually. The big problem with its geography is actually its climate. The lower part, pretty much right there at Stockholm, is the dividing line, although that is changing because of global warming, is that the southern part of Sweden is generally semi-temperate. It's not like super warm, obviously, because, we're talking places that have the latitudes of Alaska, right? But like Anchorage in the summer, when it is summer, it's kind of nice. You can grow some food. You can, live here pretty comfortably. It's not, it's not terribly hot, right? But it's pretty decently warm. It can get in the 80s. Maybe it can even crack 90 on a really hot day. 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So, southern Sweden, pretty good. When you get into northern Sweden, climate still gets more like tundric, or more like the tundra, or very, very much like northern Canada. It's just so cold for most of the year that the only time it really breaks freezing is very late spring into summer, and it usually won't get above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, hardly at all in this kind of region. It can every now and again, but breaking 75 is really rare. However, the geography, as far as like the topography, is actually really nice. Almost all the mountains are in Norway. There's some hills in Sweden, don't get me wrong, but it's pretty flat. It's actually like a giant coastal plain, and that goes into Finland too. And so there's a few rivers that you can't really float anything on, but it's really good for the topography. AA was saying when I was young, it was often negative 35°C at the top where I live. And the top is up in the Samny regions, which is where I was talking about where it doesn't really ever crack 75, even on the hottest day. When it gets winterized, it gets cold. This is places where you literally don't see sun for 3 months of the year. That's how high up this is. And so, make a long story short, when it comes to the geography, Sweden, the climate, definitely cold, but southern Sweden not too terribly bad. Very, very more like most of northern Europe, and it's actually got quite a more of a light Mediterranean kind of climate in the regards that the Baltic Sea kind of keeps that waterized version of heat control going on. So it's usually a little bit cooler during the day and a little bit warmer during the night, which is kind of nice. But it's very very nice climatologically, at least compared to most of the rest of the region. Um, when we're talking about the geography, yeah, it's relatively flat, not super flat. There's some areas that are more hilly than others, yeah. And not any kind of major navigable rivers in this regard. But they don't really need it. Like everything within 100 miles of Sweden is at the coast, and so you can literally just roll to the coast, put it on a boat, and ship it to the Baltic. That's actually why. That's actually why the Swedes were going for Baltic superpower status back during that time. Is that if they could control the Baltic, that would make a massive geopolitical, economic engine they could build out on. They were right. And in fact, with the post-Cold War, where everyone's on the same side, where you have the Poles, the Baltic states, Finland, and Sweden all having relatively good relations and all being on the same side where they can trade freely, we've seen quite a bit of outpouring on trade and economic development in this region as things are able to ship from A to B and they can actually trade and interact and engage with each other. It's been very, very good for the whole region as a whole. Of course, I'm expecting that this is going to come to an end in the future. We'll tag that here just shortly. But it's going to be very interesting. I think that really covers it. So we're gonna do the future of Sweden. So what is the future of Sweden? It looks scary, but I'm not as scared as I am for a lot of other European countries. I'm very interested to see where the political alignment goes out, because if there's any country that I'm not afraid of going completely hard right fascistic, Sweden's one of the top 5 that I'm not convinced if Europe is going to go to complete craziness. Part of that is because that they're one of the last places that can actually get immigration, particularly from the land routes. They basically have to put everybody in a boat. I'm not worried about that, but they are definitely going to see a more right-wing leaning governments, particularly as they have to militarize. Now, this is obviously for anyone watching or isn't familiar with my forecast. I'm looking at a world that looks a lot more neo-imperial. What we're looking at is that they're going to have to make a lot more relations with the Norwegians. They might even make them a former protectorate, straight out, as Norway can't defend itself for one, and more importantly, all the major natural resources, that is of natural gas and oil, largely comes from Norway, from this region. And so the Swedes actually might, on a geopolitical level, come in and say, hey, look, we'll protect you, we just want to cut, so that we have enough to keep the lights on. Or they will at least just try to mutually defend Norway so that everything kind of keeps chugging along. That is going to require more defensive measures. That's actually going to require a more militaristic-leaning government. The Swedes can do this. They've demonstrated many, many times they have a militaristic tradition that really hasn't horribly died out. There is going to be that. Now, if they consider like a Russia that actually gets more hands-on with particularly Eastern Europe, let's just say Ukraine, or they see that Germany starts rearming, Sweden's going to pay attention. And I have said this many, many times, but I'm calling it. The next nation to likely join the nuclear club will be Sweden. If they actually think that Russia is becoming a threat again, which they're not going to be on the chopping block at the first zone. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying the Russians are going to invade Sweden. No. If the Russians actually start reaching out and touching their former Soviet possessions, particularly the Baltic states, then you'll see a very, very involved Sweden. And that will be a very rapidly militarizing Sweden. And if you see something like that, and or you see Germany openly going, hey, we're rearming because the Americans aren't here to protect us, and, these damn French aren't helping us out. If that were to ever come to pass, I've said it once, I've said it many, many times, the next likely country to join the party is the Swedes on the nuclear club. The only country that I think even rivals this in likelihood is South Korea. So if I'm off by one, forgive me, but I think it's absolutely going to be between these two that actually joins the nuclear club. We'll see where this goes. I might be wrong, but there's the definitive forecast for you guys, is that Sweden will be either number 10 or 11 definitively that will get the bomb next. And so, let's see. Finishing this out, I don't think that the government in Sweden is at too likely of throwing out its democracy like a lot of the mainland European nations are. That's not what I'm concerned about with Sweden. Sweden's just going to have to be very, very careful how it plays its cards because it just doesn't have enough cards to play. If there's a very aggressive Germany, they're going to have to figure out how to handle that, maybe even contain it. I don't know if that's going to be adversarial or whether they're actually going to play ball with Germany. If Germany becomes a lot more fascistic, probably not. If we're talking about how they're going to deal with the Russians, that's actually a lot more likely to provoke a negative reaction from the Swedes. They don't exactly have the warmest relations now, and if Russia were to ever actually walk troops into Finland or the Baltic states, the Swedes are not going to take that line down. I don't know if they'll actually send troops. I doubt they will, because that's not really a winning proposition for them. But you will probably see a very, very strong reaction to that, and it will probably be something on the order of Sweden announcing that it's either started a nuclear program or they've actually built a bomb. And remind you, I've said this many times, Sweden can do this in a weekend. It's not terribly hard to build a bomb. They have the nuclear facilities already. That's part of the nuclear civil. That's part of a civil nuclear program. That's not terribly hard to go from a civil to weapons grade uranium and weapons grade plutonium. That's not much of a jump. And so all you have to do is build a trigger mechanism. Anyone who's actually half intelligent can build this literally in their garage. It's basically just electronic wiring. And so when you go past that point, it'll be very interesting to see where this goes. That's the limited. Going further, I don't see any reason why Sweden's going to go into complete and utter disarray or collapse. Their demography is pretty strong. It's not the best, but it's one of the best in all of Europe. It's actually more chimney-like instead of inverting. They got quite a number of young people. Some of them are immigrants, don't get me wrong, and there's going to be a real conversation for the Swedes, which are a little bit ethno-nash compared to what we Americans are used to, and how they're going to handle that. But if there's any government that looks like it's actually going to handle this pretty well, it's probably Sweden. So we'll see where this goes. But I would venture to guess that Sweden's not going to be part of the major economic disarrays that we'll see throughout most of the continent. They're not going to be part of the major political changes that we'll see through most of the continent. But how they react to those, how they have to play their cards in a Europe that looks a lot more hostile, that is going to be their major things they have to contend with. And it's one thing to predict phase 1, where everybody ends up, but this is phase 2. This is asking how everyone reacts, and that's really hard to forecast when phase 1 is still kind of up in the air at this point. So, on that note, I think I'm going to close out the question, or not questions, but I'm going to close out the forecast for Sweden. I think I give a pretty good reason there. It's just you're going to see at least a bit more right-wing, more militarized Sweden in the coming years as world organizations like NATO and the World Trade Organizations and maybe even the UN probably goes to crap. I've said that many times, so there you go. If anyone has any questions about Sweden in the chat, feel free to do so, and we'll wrap this on up. I'll give you guys about 5 minutes. If you keep having good conversations, we'll be good. If not, I'll close out here very shortly. I finally get to eat my sandwich. It's kind of nice. If anyone is listening to the podcast or the recording of this on YouTube, feel free to drop your conversations into feel free to drop your comments down below if you're on YouTube, and if you're listening to the podcast, reminder that you can contact me on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, or in the chat of this wonderful show. It absolutely works very, very well for us. There are people there that are doing so, and I really appreciate that. But reminder that some of you aren't. I definitely can tell that there's a lot more people that are just listening and observing than people that are actively engaging in the show. That's fine. you don't want to, obviously on you. But I really want to know, those that are just listening, observing, what you think. Do you really like the show? Do you think there could be more to having in the show? That'd be great. Just give me some general feedback. I'd really appreciate it, guys. It's possible. I've got a few conversations going on in the chat, but they're all kind of related to other countries, particularly in how Germany's handling certain things, or just general comments like Sweden had an excellent approach to COVID, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but Sweden started out really strong there, but then they kind of dropped the ball and got like everybody sick at once. I don't remember how the Swedes handled COVID's been a mess. So what are we talking about today? Elric, good morning. All right, guys, I'm actually going to close out the recording session. I don't see any major conversation pieces on finishing out Sweden. So for anyone here in the chat, we'll close we'll have questions up for about another 10 minutes. But if you've been listening to the show, I want to thank you all for coming in. I really appreciate that. If you're listening to the podcast, yes, definitely get to contact me. If you want to join the patrons community, I'd really appreciate it. The current line is anyone who's spent more than $50 on the show. If you really like the show, but you just want to throw 5, 10, whatever, I'd really appreciate it. You can find ways to help us by donations and subscriptions by contacting me or at the bottom of the YouTube screen. I'd really appreciate that. I think I've plugged everything else. Tomorrow we'll be talking about Finland. That will be a pretty straightforward episode altogether. This won't be nearly as long as the Sweden. It'll be a lot more like Norway. But until then, I appreciate you all very much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.